All right, let's bow our heads before we get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for being with us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for giving us what we need each and every day. Help us to trust in you and listen to where you guide us. In Christ's name, amen. Today I'm going to be talking about, quite literally, how Jonah ran from God. I'm also going to be talking about how we, like Jonah, run from God, or we run to Him. Because depending on how we view Him individually at any given time, we will be doing one or the other. It's important to realize there is no standing still with Jesus. Either we're trying to go to Him, or we're trying to get away from Him. Matthew 12:30 says, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." Before we get into that, though, I'd like to introduce you to the place that God told Jonah to go to when he decided it was time to run away. Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire during Jonah's time, was founded by Cush, Noah's grandson. In Genesis 10:11, Noah, Ham, Cush, and Nimrod. We'll talk more about Nimrod in a minute, but Nineveh is described throughout the Old Testament as, and I can give you the verses later if you're interested, Nineveh is described as great, extensive, rich, strong, commercial, populous, and then we get to the fun ones. Vile, wicked, idolatrous, full of carelessness, and Zephaniah prophesies that the desolation of it will become the resting place for beasts. Full of lies and robbers, full of witchcraft. Nimrod, Cush's son and grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, is described as the first man of might on the earth. A mighty hunter. Nimrod was the first to establish a great empire and was a well-known hunter. In fact, rabbinic tradition in the Tower of Babel is called the House of Nimrod, where idolatry was practiced and divine homage was offered to Nimrod. Fast forwarding about 1,200 years to the reign of the Assyrian king Ashur, this is a fun one to say, Ashurbanipal. The following will give you an idea of who the Assyrians had become. He wrote in the Assyrian Bulletin of War, "I destroyed, I demolished, I burned, I took their warriors prisoners and impaled them on stakes before the city, filleted their nobles as many had rebelled and spread their skins on the piles." There's more, but you don't want to hear all of that. Fast forwarding about another 100 years, and we get to the time of Jonah. Nothing had changed in the last 100 years, and the Assyrians are up to their same old stuff. So Jonah has to go to the city that is the capital of the sadistic empire, which contains a population upwards of 120,000 people. That's a little less than Nampa and Caldwell combined. Now, all of these people, a bunch of crazies, only live in about a 3 square mile area. Around the city is a 50-foot high, 50 feet thick wall that encircles the city. It's about 8 miles long in total if you walk around the top. And after about 35 years after this, after Jonah finally delivers the message, Assyria attacks the northern kingdoms of Israel and takes some of them into exile back to Assyria. This would be the first of many successful attacks and banishments of both Israel and Judah. So Jonah would have known all this, being the prophet that he was. Many have possibly come to the idea of how Assyria would be used by God against the Israelites and some of the attacks I just mentioned. Now that we know all this information, it provides some context for today's sermon. I know that most of you have heard the story of Jonah before. God tells the guy to do something, he runs from God, gets eaten by fish, gets picked up by fish 3 days later, blah, blah, blah. There actually is a lot more to the story than appears on the surface. By the way, we'll be talking a little bit later about the whole getting eaten by a fish thing. In the story, great thing about this story is it's not only about Jonah, but it's also a story about us. Like Jonah, we have run from God at some point in our lives. Maybe not, it wasn't necessarily running away in a physical sense, but maybe someone grew up in the church and was forced to go by their parents, and then upon graduating high school, left the church altogether. Or maybe someone is currently running from him emotionally or financially, because they feel there is safety in distancing themselves from him for some reason. I told you earlier that we run away from God or we run to God, depending on where we view him at any particular time in our lives. Here's what I mean. In verse 1 and 2 of Jonah 1, Jonah receives a call from God. He tells him to go to Nineveh, about 700 miles away. This would have taken Jonah about a month to walk if he did 20 miles a day. Instead, according to Jonah's testimony later in the story, Jonah thought God was wrong to tell him to go to Nineveh. So Jonah decided to head to Tarshish, which is 3 times the distance from Nineveh in the opposite direction. You see, it wasn't as if Jonah was inherently a bad person. Actually, he was a very patriotic Jew and prophet. However, Jonah didn't trust God and thought his decision was wrong. Jonah didn't understand God's master plan in all of this. And though he knew better than to go to this wicked place such as Nineveh, and thought he knew better than to go to this wicked place such as Nineveh. Don't you see how we can be a lot like Jonah sometimes? Because we don't understand God's plan. Sometimes we decide to take control of our own lives. Because the bottom line is, we are not trusting him. We either trust him or we don't. We either run to God because we trust him, or we run from God because we don't trust him. So here in Jonah, running from God because he isn't trusting him, the plans he has made, he is doing his best to outrun God. But he couldn't. Neither can we. We can run from God, but we cannot outrun God. Before I continue, I want you to remember this. Running from God does not negate his calling for your life. Whatever the calling is, there is no safety in denial. In other words, denying that there was ever a call from God in the first place will only lead to distance from God. Being at his side is truly the only safe place for any of us. Keeping ourselves at a distance, no matter what we have done, is when hurt, calamity, and strife hit us the hardest. Well, Jonah heard God's call. Jonah straight up objected to it. Then he jumped on the first thing, sailing in the opposite direction. Jonah thought he would be safer in denying God's command. And well, see here in the following verse, his thought process will prove to have been quite flawed. Verses 4 through 16 are arranged in what is called a chasm, the way of writing in Hebrew that was popular. A chasm is just a writing style that uses repetitions pattern to clarify and or emphasize. These verses contain the meat of the first chapter and are where God's mercy and love for Jonah, as well as everyone else, is revealed. This is what a chasm is. So the first, if you're looking at what a chasm is, the first line would be like line A, then line B, then line C, then line D. And then it would be, the second part of it would be D, C, B, A. So they relate to each other. Okay? So, in verses 4 and 5, the sailors are frightened. Verses, the end of 5, the sailors pray to their God. The sailors unload their ship. The captain's speech to Jonah. The sailors word to each other. The sailors questioning Jonah who you are. Jonah confesses. And then we start to see the repetition. Instead of the sailors questioning to Jonah who you are, the sailors question to Jonah, what have you done? Instead of the sailors word to each other, the sailors question Jonah, what shall we do? The captain's speech to Jonah, Jonah's word to the sailors, it repeats backwards. The sailors rowing the ship instead of the sailors unloading the ship. The sailors' prayer to the Lord instead of the sailors praying to their gods. And finally, the sailors' fear of the Lord instead of the sailors' fright. The first verse corresponds with the last, the second to the second last, etc. Simply put, a chasm is a repetition of similar ideas in a reverse sequence. The importance of the chiastic structure is founded in hidden emphasis. The hidden emphasis in these verses is that regardless of our view of God, he is and always will be the God of mercy. Now you may be asking yourself, how can God be the God of mercy when he called down a storm like Jonah and those guys who had nothing to do with it? Or how can God be a merciful God when he allows sailors to throw Jonah overboard believing he would die? Or how can God be a merciful God when he made a fish swallow Jonah? Real quick, there's a difference between grace and mercy. Mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace is getting what you don't deserve. Don't you see that Jonah's flat out sinned against God? God told him to do something, and he did the exact opposite. Scripture says the punishment for sin is death. Did Jonah die? No. That's mercy. Here, Jonah is on this ship, involving others in his sin, because now they are affected by this storm that God has started. They are freaking out, thinking they are going to sink, or so they start praying to their gods to ease the storm. Of course, that doesn't work. So they start throwing everything they can spare off the ship to lighten it. Meanwhile, Jonah, whose fault this all is, is somehow sleeping below deck in the middle of the horrific storm. Take a minute to think about how his frame of mind and how self-involved he must have been. He is knowingly running from God because he doesn't trust him and thinks he knows better. And now he has involved some innocent people in the consequences of his sin and is currently in the state of I don't care because he's below deck sleeping, leaving everyone else to deal with the circumstances. It says the sailors became afraid and every man cried to his God. And they threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below into the hold of the ship and laid down and fallen asleep. It doesn't say that Jonah was sleeping and then the storm hit. It says everyone was freaking out, and instead of helping, Jonah went and took a nap. Again, he was perhaps finding safety in denial. He denied this had anything to do with him, so he retreated below deck out of the wind, water, clamor of the sailors. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? We are so totally like this sometimes, right? We do something messed up because we have run from the right decision and God, and in the end involve others in our problems because we don't want to face reality. Like Jonah, those who are close to us may not physically Jonah, those who are close to us, maybe not physically like in Jonah's case, but maybe emotionally get hurt the most by the things we do. We try to justify it, of course. We say things like, this is just between me and God. It's nobody else's business. Or it's my body. I can do fill in the blank if I want. It doesn't involve anyone else. That's not true. There are people who care about you and who don't want to see you make it on your own without God. There are people who hurt because you are in pain, either physically or emotionally, because of a sin you have committed and left unconfessed. Back to the story. We pick up in verse 6. So Jonah is down below sleeping while the storm is raging and the sailors are freaking out. The captain finds Jonah sleeping and is like, dude, how can you sleep through all this? We've all been praying to our gods and we might as well give it a shot to pray to yours. Meanwhile, sailors are casting lots to further try and figure out what's going on. Casting lots was throwing of a small group of stones, sticks, or sometimes similar into a small area that would point in a specific person or metaphoric direction or choice. Anyway, they are all trying to figure out what's going on. Well, a lot fell to Jonah and they asked him, so what's up? As soon as Jonah confesses, they are all like, why would you do that? As in, are you crazy? You know the God of everything, and what's more, he literally told you to go do something and you didn't do it. And now we've got us all mixed up in this mess. Naturally, the sailors then turn to Jonah and ask, what should we do with you now? He says, chuck me overboard and you'll be good to go. Their reaction is interesting. They decide to start rowing for shore because they don't want the responsibility of Jonah's death, especially since he serves a God that can bring such a crazy storm like this one that is currently raging. What happens after that is even more interesting. God could have just killed Jonah from the get-go. He could have sunk the ship when Jonah kept heading away from Nineveh and killed everyone on board. He could have done a lot of things to exact his justice for the sin and worship of false gods. And rightfully so. But instead, God sent a storm, not to kill people, not to cause them to run harder and further away, but to turn their hearts to Him, to show them that the living life apart from God is dangerous, uncertain, and scary. God showed them mercy because instead of allowing them to die, He spared them so that they may turn to Him. So what did the sailors who previously didn't believe in Jonah's God do after they realized rowing was doing no good and the storm was worsening? They began to pray to God. They asked him not to hold them accountable for Jonah's impending death. It says in Romans 8:28. And now we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. This is amazing. Many believers were added to the fold in spite of Jonah's sin. God truly is merciful. So by this time, Jonah is ready to take his licks, so to speak. The sailors throw him overboard, and immediately the sea becomes calm. The sailors then offer up a sacrifice to God and make vows to serve Him. Jonah's out there floating around, but he doesn't die as the sailors believe he would. God's mercy again. Not giving Jonah what he deserves. Then God figured He's got to get Jonah back to land. And what better way than in the belly of the fish? I'm not sure Jonah would have liked to be rescued in a different way. I'm sure Jonah would have liked to be rescued in a different way. But I guess he should have thought of that before he ran from God. The point is, God's merciful and saves him several times by my count. This last time by being eaten by a fish. Strange to us maybe, but Romans 11:33 sums it up this way. Oh, the depths, the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are His judgments and unfathomable His ways. Okay, now, about the fish thing. There are many, many documented cases of fully grown men being eaten whole by great white sharks and great white sharks measuring 15 feet in length and being eaten whole by sperm whales. Great white sharks being eaten whole by sperm whales. I'm not saying that the great fish in Jonah's story was a whale or a shark or maybe even a whale shark. What I'm saying is either is plausible, but so is a fish that God specifically created for just an occasion. If He created everything else, why couldn't He create one for just this purpose? Besides that, it wasn't until 1778 that whales were first recognized as a mammal, not a fish. So the story of Jonah calling a whale a great fish would have been historically accurate. All right, let's wrap up. Here's the deal. Like I said in the beginning, we run to God or we run away from God, depending on how we view Him. We view Him as untrustworthy and mean, we will run away from Him. If we view Him as loving and merciful, we will run to Him. Today I would like us all to ask ourselves, are we running away from God or to God? What is the evidence for either? Do you find yourself running for your prayer life, your Christian friends, church, running away with your finances, or just flat out attempting to run from His presence like Jonah? If so, it's because you don't trust Him and because you think He is mean and unfair. If this is you, I encourage you to stop running right now. Make today the day when you turn back to Him and run into His loving and accepting arms. If you are one that is running to Him, don't quit. As strong as we think we are nothing without Him. Remember, there is no safety in denial. The enemy wants to give us false senses of safety. And anything that will occupy our thoughts and time that is not godly, whether it be video games, TV relationships, cell phones, etc. Continue to make God a priority in your life. And don't just give Him lip service. Don't just say you're a Christian. Be a Christian.